A very good morning, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Deputy Prime Minister and Coordinating Minister for Economic and Social Policies, Republic of Singapore, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Governor, Reserve Bank of India, His Excellency Mr. T.K. Lim, High Commissioner of Singapore to India, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and Ambassador-at-Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, Mr. N Ninan, Deputy Chairman, CII Western Region, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS for short, at the National University of Singapore, and our co-organizing partner, Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, we warmly welcome you to this morning's Singapore Symposium 2016. This Singapore Symposium is a signature event organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies, and today's session is our fourth edition of the symposium in India and fifth in this region. The highlight of the Singapore Symposium 2016 is the interactive session that all of us have been waiting for with Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister and Coordinating Minister for Economic and Social Policies, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and the Honorable Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Raghuram Rajan. And to commence today's proceedings, it's my great pleasure to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and Ambassador-at-Large, Singapore's Foreign Ministry, to deliver the welcome remarks. Ambassador, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming on a working day, especially so early in the morning. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Coordinating Affairs Policies of Economics and Social Matters, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Governor of the Central Bank of India, RBI, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, High Commissioner for Singapore, T.K. Lim, Consul General, Mr. Ajit Singh, Mr. Ninan, Mr. Mugundan of CII, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces here, quite a large number of Singaporeans and quite a large number of friends of Singapore, like Mr. Deepak Parekh. I know Shyamal Gupta is here, the first Tata man in Singapore. So we have a very good cross-section of Singapore supporters in this thing. The Singapore Symposium, as Sitara says, is something that we devised to present in India. Unlike other think tanks, which do a lot of academic work on various policies, matters, and so on, we do one step further. We go to the countries in South Asia and interact with them. We actually hold programs, workshops, seminars, book launches, and so on. We did a book launch on a book on Maoism, and the launch was done by Dr. Ansari. And he asked me, why is that Singapore is doing it? I haven't seen anybody else doing it. So I said, yes, our interest is quite widespread, and we look at various matters, not only just economics or political science, but other relevant issues that affect South Asia. As Sitara said, this is our fourth edition. The very first one, the guest of honor was our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. He had a dialogue with Mr. Ratan Tata. The second one, we had a dialogue between our Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, and Gautam Thapa of Aspen Ananda. The third one was a dialogue in Chennai between our then Foreign Minister, Mr. Shanmugam, and Shyam Saran. This is the fourth one, and this one we have, as you see, two iconic figures in the finance world having a dialogue. There will be a free flow of sort of ideas and issues discussed, and it will be open to the House as well. And later on, you will have a chance to ask the questions. The dialogue between a member of the financial community in Singapore, the highest official, and Singapore's foreign minister. I need not give too much of background on these people because I think it's all very well known. But perhaps because it's the first one that we are having in Mumbai and the first one that our Deputy Prime Minister is having in Mumbai, maybe I'll say just a couple of words about him. He started off as the managing director before he entered politics. He was the managing director of Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is the counterpart of RBI and like a governor. From there, he entered politics. He became finance minister. Then he became finance minister plus deputy prime minister. And after the last general election, he took the current position of deputy prime minister and coordinating minister. I'm not giving details of this to entice any other central banker to follow the same footsteps. The thought has not occurred to me. So dismiss the thought, but I just wanted to say that was not my intention. I would like to, even though I referred to it earlier, I would like to say a couple of minutes to say something about ISAS. We are a think tank within the National University of Singapore, established and funded by the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Industry. There are other think tanks in Singapore, such as the Institute of Southeast Asian, Institute of Middle East, School of Policy Studies, LKY School of Policy Studies, and then we are there as South Asia. Many people ask, why does Singapore have so many think tanks? The answer is very simple. Singapore is a small country which suffers with, or which has to endure anything that goes on in the world. So it needs to be well equipped with knowledge on the various countries, on the various regions, on the various organizations. So we have this particular interest, and we have a very active institutes that study the various regions. It is something that we do in cooperation with the university. We also do it in cooperation with institutes outside. For instance, this particular edition of Symposium, we are in partnership with CII. And we have been partnering CII on many issues, and I want to place on record my thanks to them. This afternoon, we have another session, a workshop, where we are partnering Gateway House. And I also want to thank Gateway House. When we discussed this particular program, we were discussing who would be best to be the moderator. The moderator has to be fair, he has to know the issues, and he needs to regulate the question flow and keep within the time. And we asked Mr. Ninan, and I'm very thankful to him for having accepted this invitation. He has been a good friend of ISAS. I've been trying to get him to come to Singapore for various things. He tries to accommodate that together with a visit to his daughter, which sometimes doesn't work out, but eventually we'll get that. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to take up more of your time. I hope you have a good evening, good morning rather, and there's a discussion that will go on, and then DPM will have a special lunch with some of the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for being here. I hope you have a fruitful morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor now to invite Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister and Coordinating Minister for Economic and Social Policies, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, on stage to deliver the opening remarks. DPM, please.
Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, who has successfully corralled all of us to be here this morning. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Mr. Ninan and Mr. Karpe and everyone who's here today. Thank you all for coming. I've been given 15 minutes to speak before I have this pleasure of this dialogue with Raghu. Of course, there's a rich tradition of extending the length of your speech so as to minimize interaction and questions from the floor. But given Raghu's presence, I think I'll stick to my time limit. I think we are at a very interesting time. Very interesting time globally, in Asia, and in each of our own countries. Globally, we are stuck on the second gear, having difficulties moving to fourth gear, let alone fifth gear. And that's true almost everywhere in the world, except possibly in China, where they need to move from fifth gear down to a more sustainable pace of growth. But in Asia, something else is happening. Even in the midst of global slowdown, Asia is restructuring. Each of our countries are restructuring. And we're restructuring in the context of a region where there's still demand, there's still a tremendous motive force in middle-class consumption, and a tremendous motive force with regard to the absorption of skills, technology, and knowledge from all over the world and between ourselves as Asians. So both from the demand side, the motive force of middle-class consumption, and from the supply side, the motive force of transfer and absorption and exchange of knowledge, skills, and technology. Something is happening in Asia that's extremely positive. And that's the context we face ourselves, that we shape policies in today. A sluggish global environment, still stuck, not much prospects, I would say, for getting onto fourth gear soon. But prospects in Asia, promise in Asia for growth based on what we ourselves do within our own countries, the reforms we put in place, as well as very importantly, the connectivity that we develop with each other. And I think it's good that we're having the Singapore Symposium in India at this time, because India itself is on the cusp of major change. It's already embarked on a process of change, and we can see it rolling out before us, but I think there's a lot more potential, a lot more potential. One of the charming things about being in India is that you'll never meet an Indian who doesn't have something negative to say about India. So my role today is to try and abstract from the usual commentaries and highlight what I, from some distance, based on my contacts with businesses, based on my contacts with many people, see as some of the important positive changes that are taking place in India, which give me confidence. First, I would say macroeconomic stability is back. And both on the monetary side as well as the fiscal side, something has been achieved in the last few years that is impressive in the face of a challenging global environment. That's the first point, and I don't need to elaborate on it. Second, something is being achieved with regard to the efficiency of implementation of policies. The Indian bureaucracy is famous, but it is changing. And I think Prime Minister Modi's initiatives, although there's still a long journey ahead, are very important in this regard. And it's many different dimensions. I was just asking Raghu about I think you call it the Aadhaar bill, and the way it's being implemented. Remarkable feat. 1 billion people with unique identification, with so many benefits, whether in the financial sector or the way social schemes are being administered to prevent leakage, so many benefits. So that's the second factor, improving the way in which things are implemented and injecting efficiency into the bureaucracy. A third factor that gives hope is, I think, the kickstarting of infrastructure. I know about the latest budget. I think it was 32 billion going to important projects, rail, road, power, kickstarting infrastructure. Still a lot of work ahead, particularly to catalyze private investment, not just using public monies, but catalyzing private investment. But I think that's a third reason for confidence. And a fourth reason, which is, I think, particularly important in the last few years, is devolution. The way in which states are being empowered and the way in which individual states are using that empowerment to compete with each other and to develop a dynamic that is more bottom-up within the politics and within the politics of economic policy making. I think it's very interesting what's happening, and there's tremendous potential there as well. So those are the four reasons: macroeconomic stability, improved efficiency in the bureaucracy and the implementation of policies, the kickstarting of much-needed infrastructural developments, and fourthly, devolution. It frankly gives me confidence in India, not just based on what's been happening in the last few years, GDP growth being above 7%, but confidence that this is now a new journey, and a journey that we in Singapore want to be part of, want to contribute to, and want to benefit from at the same time. The potential can best be summarized by looking at productivity. The level of productivity in India compared to, let's say, the United States, taking that broadly speaking as a frontier of sorts, the level of productivity in India was for a long time stuck at about 5 to 6% of the level in the United States, just 1/20th. Even until the 1990s, and even in the early 2000s, it was barely about 6 to 7%. In the last 5 years, it has started to pick up quite significantly, and today it's about 12%. But that's still a long way to go, and that illustrates the potential for not just GDP, but the incomes of the average person, incomes across the board, to rise. The fact that productivity can still catch up with global standards across a whole range of sectors, tremendous potential. If you look at India's rate of productivity growth, in the last 5 years, it was something like 3.8%. We may think, oh, not bad, 3.8%, about 4%, let's say, not bad. But that's actually not good enough and is well below India's potential. If you look, for instance, at the rate of productivity growth that we saw in China about a decade ago, when the level of productivity was the same as India today, or look at Korea back in the 1970s, when the level of productivity was where India is today. If you look at what happened to those two reasonably large-sized economies, China, of course, continental scale, but Korea, a large-sized economy, they achieved productivity growth of between 5 to 8% at that stage of development. So I would say India has the potential to grow at a rate of productivity growth of not just the impressive 4.4% seen in the last 5 years, but 3 to 4% more than that. But it doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen automatically. And I believe that connectivity and skills are a very important way in which we can encourage that potential to be achieved. So that's one way of summarizing it. I think our relations between each other, business, broader economic relations, in politics, and the people-to-people relations have really grown. India is actually now, at least from our perspective, a very significant partner of Singapore, and it's well known that we are a major investor in India. But there are more things that we can do together that make sense from the point of view of India's journey and make sense from the point of view of a Singapore that is still internationalizing, still upgrading, still trying to achieve its full promise. And I'll mention just 4 areas. First, in finance, there's more we can do together. Infrastructure, which I just spoke about, is a major opportunity. We can still do more to catalyze private finance in infrastructure. It's not a problem unique to India. It's a global issue. There's a lot of money waiting on the sidelines, not looking for extravagant returns, looking for decent returns, upper single-digit returns. But there are a lot of obstacles that are preventing the money that's waiting on the sidelines from being invested in infrastructure projects, particularly long gestation infrastructure projects. But we can solve these things. And we are working in Singapore with the World Bank and the private sector, first to develop better project documentation so that there's better certainty on dispute resolution, termination clauses, and the like, provide better certainty. Second, we are working on developing infrastructure as an asset class. If you think about how the insurance funds, the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds manage a very substantial pool of assets. It's an asset allocation process. It's not just looking at projects on a bespoke basis, case by case. You need to decide how much to allocate to this asset class. And it means you need good data on risks, on returns, from a whole range of countries by different verticals, and you need good analysis. And that is not yet in place for infrastructure as an asset class, and that's something we're developing as well. Making infrastructure an asset class so as to catalyze the flow of investments from the institutional investors, meaning pension funds, insurers, and sovereign wealth funds. And thirdly, another way in which we can promote infrastructure financing, which we are working on in Singapore, is a debt takeout facility that will help the transfer from banks to institutional investors beyond the construction stage or the first stage of infrastructure projects. In other words, beyond the greenfield stage. How do we basically allow banks to recycle their capital and help institutional investors come in? A debt takeout facility is one of the ideas we have that we're working on. So that's infrastructure. Tremendous scope for collaboration between Singapore and India in that space. More broadly, cross-border finance, both banking and non-banking. I think there's particular scope for offshore rupee-denominated bond issuance. Indian companies are interested, not just the majors, but a range of medium-sized companies are interested. And there's a investor pool in Singapore, quite a diverse investor pool that knows India and wants to invest in India. And the rupee-denominated bonds have features which I think are a win-win. Certainly for the Indian companies, it means the currency risk is taken by the investor, and if the investor is managing it as a portfolio, there are ways in which you can buffer yourself from currency risk. So offshore rupee-denominated bonds, I think, has significant scope in the future. More broadly, cross-border banking, not just Singapore banks lending to major companies in India, but even SMEs. I think there's significant scope left for cross-border banking to be built up between our two countries. Thirdly, less talked about, but important, is insurance. Catastrophe risk is an issue on everyone's minds. We know about the natural disasters. And in the case of India, there was a UN study which calculated that India loses about $10 billion per year just through natural disasters. We now know more about the emerging man-made catastrophes, cybercrime, pandemics, terrorism, All of us are going to have to grapple with this. But that too is about catastrophe risk that needs to be insured. And this is where, when you think of the scale and complexity of catastrophe risk, it really makes sense to diversify. You've got to be able to aggregate across insurers and across markets. And that's why the reinsurance industry exists. And that's why it has to be global. It can't be country-specific reinsurance. In its very nature, you need diversification to be able to manage that risk. And the Singapore insurance providers, the reinsurance market especially, is well-placed and keen to be able to play a role in catastrophe insurance in India by providing capacity, expertise, and financial relief in case of loss. So that's finance, and I've spoken longer about finance than I will about the next few items. But I want to say as my second major item that we have scope to collaborate on air connectivity. And this is, it's something which many countries grapple with because we all have our own airlines, but we also have the interests of our economy at large to think about. And in the Singapore example, partly because of our size, we decided early on that we'd go for maximizing connectivity and have an open regime rather than a policy of focusing on our own single national airline. This worked well for Singapore in ways that we didn't fully expect even. But air connectivity is critical in so many dimensions. It's critical for foreign direct investment. It's critical for creating a business-friendly environment generally. It's critical for tourism. And I would say in the case of India, it also offers the potential for Delhi and Mumbai to be major hubs for West Asia and a broader landscape. It's not just about people moving in and out of India or businesses moving in and out of India. It is an opportunity for what are now world-class airports in Delhi and Mumbai to be major hubs for West Asia and to not cede that space to your competitors. It's a real opportunity. And when you think of the critical mass of activity, of critical mass of business that flows through India itself, that's a very strong foundation to build a larger international hub out of air connectivity. And here again, Singapore can play a role. I think this makes eminent sense for India, and it's something which we would like to play a role in. We've got to free up the airspace to benefit our larger economy and to spur the growth of new industries. And finally, actually I just realized I had 3 areas of collaboration, not 4. Finally, the whole field of, no, actually I do have 4, just remembered. My third area has to do with education and skills. The most fundamental driver of convergence and productivity, which is what I mentioned earlier, the most fundamental driver of economic development is just human capital for all of us, wherever we are in the world. And I think we have the opportunity to deepen our relationships in skills development at a time when India is placing great emphasis on skills development. We already embarked on some projects in Delhi, in Rajasthan, but there's also a lot of just the sharing of ideas on how we go about organizing education and skills training for a future that is quite different from the past. So that's the third area. And finally, smart cities. Singapore is embarked on a journey of becoming a smart nation. We are both a city and a nation. India is embarking on a journey of developing, I believe, 20 smart cities. Tremendous opportunity for investments, for transfer of skills and know-how, and for learning from each other. It's not just going to be one-way learning from each other. Tremendous opportunity. Our companies are keen. We have people who are quite excited about what's taking place in India. Of course, Singapore being a small place, we can't get involved in too many cities, but where we do get involved, I think we can add some value on India's smart city journey. So those are the 4 areas I'd like to mention: increase connectivity in finance, Second, air connectivity. Thirdly, education and skills. And fourthly, collaboration on smart cities. I think there's potential for us to do a lot more together. Singapore is a very small player, but one that's intrinsically globalized and intrinsically based on human capital development. And India, which is on a journey of achieving its full promise as a large society that is still very far from what it is able to achieve, but is now moving in a very impressive way. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to a dialogue with Raghu. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Next is the moment we have been waiting for, the highlight of today's Singapore Symposium, the interactive session with DPM Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Governor Dr. Raghuram Rajan. And with great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together and invite Dr. Rajan and Mr. N Ninan, Chairman of Business Standard Limited India, on stage for the session, please. Mr. Ninan will chair the interactive session, and I shall now hand over the session to him. Mr. Ninan, please.
Thank you very much, and morning, friends. We have, as was correctly stated, I think, by Ambassador Pillai, two iconic gentlemen who are both national leaders and on the global stage here with us this morning. And it's a great opportunity to get them to interact with each other on a range of issues. So it's my pleasure to try and sort of steer the conversation, if I can, initially onto some international issues, because the subject that we have is partnering for growth, and then try and dwell on some bilateral and domestic issues. So I'll start with Mr. Shanmugaratnam. I'd like to quote to you what Dr. Rajan has said in, I forget whether it's a speech or an article he wrote, where he, looking at what's happening in the world and some of the policy issues that you mentioned in your opening remarks, on whether there is a need for a new IMF.
So I'm familiar with Raghu's thinking, and I share his basic way of thinking about the problem. And I also agree with him that part of the solution to what is currently a highly uncoordinated international monetary and financial system has to involve the IMF as a custodian of sorts in the system. I agree with Dr. Rajan on that basic framework of thinking. I think we are some ways off from coming to a clear understanding amongst the major parties, but a process of open thinking has begun, and Dr. Rajan, more than anyone else, has been pushing that. I would say there are two dimensions to this, if I could just elaborate for a minute. First is the longer-term vision of what might be a sustainable system, something that is not constantly prone to instability in exchange rates and capital flows. But we do have a short to medium-term problem. Well before we can arrive at solutions for the longer term, we do have a short to medium-term problem of divergence in performance of economies, particularly the US, which is well on the road to recovery. In fact, it's a relatively healthy economy already. versus Europe and Japan, which are still at close to, have minimal growth, and in fact are seeing some weakening in their economies, and versus emerging markets where China is in the midst of a move towards a more sustainable rate of growth, and other emerging markets like India and ASEAN, who are faced with the problems created by the lack of coordination between the major players, problems of volatile capital flows, volatile exchange rates. And China has had to face that more acutely than most players in recent times. What do we do in the short to medium term? And I'll be happy to get Dr. Rajan's views on this. I think we can't keep hoping that the US Fed will postpone normalization of interest rates. First, it doesn't make sense for the US economy. It would be bad monetary policy, in fact. But we have to have some way of preventing that eventuality from also meaning significant instability in exchange rates and capital flows at a time when Japan, Europe, and China are facing very different economic conditions. It's not going to happen by wishing. There has to be some form of coordination. Some form of coordination with regard to exchange rates that involves intervention operations, that involves an understanding as to the zone in which we would like the major exchange rates to be. It would certainly help emerging markets because they've been at the receiving end of exchange rate volatility. But the major players have to agree, not just through one G20 meeting or side meeting. We've got to agree in this, I hesitate to say this, but in the way that the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord were agreed on. Imperfect, doesn't guarantee stability, but it is better than leaving it entirely to the short-termism of the markets and the self-reinforcing expectations of the markets.
Thank you very much for those exhaustive comments. Raghu, do you want to?
No, I think as you would have guessed, Deputy Prime Minister and I agree very much on many issues on the international economy. And I have to say for this audience, some of whom may not know him, he's one of the central figures in international meetings, and he always has something original and interesting to say to the Assembly, always measured, thoughtful, and very valuable insights. I think on this issue, certainly what we're facing in the world is really a concatenation of two problems. One, within industrial countries, a concern about longer-term growth and where that's coming from. There seem to be headwinds which are beyond the debt overhang which emerged post-crisis. Perhaps some of these headwinds were in the making even before the crisis, disguised to some extent by the easy borrowing. And two which come to mind immediately are aging of populations in Germany, in other parts of Europe, certainly in Japan, but also in China increasingly. So that's one sort of headwind, largely in industrial countries, but also in some emerging markets. And the second headwind that we don't fully understand is the significant slowdown in productivity growth. Where is the productivity that used to be there? Is it disguised or is it absent? That certainly is another concern and may in fact contribute to lower growth. Given that, there has been a tremendous attempt at stimulating economies back to growth. And the increasing debate is whether the stimulus is creating not just the absence of growth longer term, but in fact retarding growth. There certainly is a little bit of a debate on that. But what the Deputy Prime Minister pointed to, the fact that could also create inter-country difficulties because of the flows of capital and currency movements. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we moving in the right direction? Is there a better way? could we at least try and make sure that we don't impose costs on each other as we try and come out of our own difficulties? So certainly there's a lot of room for discussion.
On the same international set of issues, I find that international trade, global trade, used to grow always much faster than global GDP growth. And in the years of rapid growth, global trade was actually growing at twice the speed of the global economy. And now, I think for the first time in I don't know how many decades, global trade is actually growing slower than the global economy. The WTO's numbers suggest increasing protectionism literally across the board in the G20 economies. All of these suggest that economies are turning in on themselves. And you've spoken, I think even recently, about the continuing need to be more open. But the world actually seems to be going in the other direction. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you. Well, that's a very important issue. I think the reasons for the slowdown in global trade are both cyclical and structural. And it's useful to put it in perspective. The cyclical is well known. Commodity prices were on a boom and they're now correcting. That's a long cycle in commodity prices. It's already happened. I don't see that continuing to depress global trade, but it's happened. Second, China was on a boom, partly credit financed, and its heavy industries were demanding a lot of commodities from abroad, a lot of materials, and that too was boosting trade. And China is now correcting. It's in a phase of significant cyclical contraction in its heavy industries. But there's also a structural phenomenon, again China-centered, which is that China is now inshoring part of the manufacturing value chain that used to be performed in other countries. There's been a restructuring of the Asian supply chain. More of it is now being done in China, and more of the high-value activities are being done in China. But even that is not something that I see as a continuing trend. It's happened over the last decade. China has restructured, but there's still a lot of scope in global value chains. And I would just add, and I know Raghu has very thoughtful views on this, although the old-style export-oriented industrialization strategies may no longer be viable, particularly if done by every country. It may not be viable in a world of weak global demand. There's still tremendous growth potential yet in supply-side linkages between our economies. Put simply, and India is in fact the classic case, or the most extreme case, I would say, because India has something like a quarter of the world's population, and in the next 10 years you're going to have about 1/3 of the world's labor force, but you only have 2% of global trade accounted for by India. So we don't have to replicate what China did or Korea did in an earlier era, but there's tremendous scope, in my opinion, for India to be part of the supply-side linkages that global value chains bring. And those supply-side linkages, which have been very important in East Asia, are really linkages that are about knowledge, skills, and technology. Singapore benefited tremendously from global value chains. We would not have arrived at where we are today if not for it. But even if you look at larger economies, there's still significant scope for FDI interpenetration, significant scope for sourcing parts of our value chain from other countries. And the studies show now, I can't remember which study it was, but it was a very good study, that shows that the more you go to the higher value end of manufacturing and industry generally, the more sophisticated the product, the higher the value, the more there is multi-country sourcing. It's in the nature of the business. Specialization matters, depth of expertise matters, and it comes from very different locations. So I think there's still significant scope left in global trade, and it'll be a mistake to start battening the hatches, to start erecting barriers quietly and surreptitiously.
Raghu, I mean, please do comment on any of those issues, but I want to put a specific question to you, which is on the supply chain, that our success in services exports, including tech, was because these companies fed into global networks and succeeded, which we've not been able to do in manufacturing. Do you see the prospect of that changing, or is it on the cards, or we still need to cover a long distance before we get there?
No, I think we're ripe for change. I think the emphasis of the government on infrastructure creation, improving logistics networks, some of which are improving because of private sector companies like Flipkart, Snapdeal, and so on, creating a huge change in warehousing and in logistics. In power, for the first time, we are close to power self-sufficient. Of course, I know the commentary on the fact that some demand is not being expressed.
I completely agree with you. We are actually for the first time.
For the first time, close to. Of course, if the distribution company restructuring is fully done, perhaps full demand can be expressed. But we're close. And given that today we're using only about 60 to 65% of available capacity, there's still room for
Yes.
more power production. So power, infrastructure, we have some way to go on human capital. But my sense is we have almost everything for the leap in production. Whether it's manufacturing, whether it's services, we can take a step forward. I think global linkages is the way the world is going. We have to take advantage of that. We should not keep saying not invented here and reject ideas that come from elsewhere. And I don't think our younger generation is in that mood. It's willing to take the best from the world and run with it. So I suspect we are on the verge of a revolution here. I do believe that we should allow our enterprises to find their way, that not plan too much the path that one has to go through, but instead create the kind of infrastructure, the kind of business environment which will allow them to go where they desire to go. And I think they will find the kinds of networks that the Deputy Prime Minister has been talking about. That will happen, and we will be in a better place 5 to 10 years from now.
Regional issues and inevitably China. You mentioned what you've mentioned before about China inshoring and lengthening its own domestic supply chain and value addition. And China is also going through some other turbulence. There's been significant capital flight. There are reports in the press about people leaving in large numbers. What is the impact of this on the rest of East Asia, particularly Southeast Asia? Is a lot of the money coming to you? Do you see turbulence as a result of these big changes to economies who are supplying basically to the Chinese market and now find that this is changing?
Well, I think China was hit by two things at once. First, what we spoke about earlier, which was that the beginning of the path of Fed normalization of interest rates was leading to a strengthening of the Chinese currency. And this happened at the same time that China was gradually liberalizing on its exchange rates. And what we saw was a significant number of corporates in China who had incurred US dollar debt, then wanting to hedge themselves, which led to a significant capital outflow. Now that's a finite problem, and from my understanding, a good part of that hedging has already taken place. Second, you now have considerable stability in the Chinese exchange rate. But it illustrates the broader problem we were talking about earlier, that we have a system where, as Dr. Rajan has been saying, countries set their monetary policies based on domestic mandates without too much regard for the spillovers and the consequences in the international system. And for emerging countries especially, these are things which you can't control for very much. It's not as if you can control for it through your own domestic monetary policy settings. It's just not the way things work. There's a global cycle, there's a risk-on, risk-off cycle, and you get buffeted by it. So China is now in a much more stable place after going through a rough patch. I think it's managed the problems very well, in my opinion, and I don't see a continued significant capital outflow occurring.
Okay, so that's a significant thing, which say that some of the fears that were sort of fairly widespread in the first 2 months of this year, you're saying is actually that phase is over. Dr. Rajan, would you?
Well, I certainly would broadly agree, and I mean, one has to ask about the nature of global capital flows when you start worrying excessively about serious depreciation in a country which is running a large current account surplus, as well as has $3 trillion of reserves still. So I guess the thinking must have been that the Chinese wanted to depreciate their currency significantly, and therefore let's get out before they actually do it. At least that was the source of the panic. But I think the Chinese authorities in every forum since then have been talking about how they wanted to maintain a stable renminbi and have matched their actions with their words with actions. I think that has been a source of stability in the last few weeks in the global economy, and I think going forward, the hope that Tharman talked about, that we would get a stable landing, is very much something we're all hoping for. I think one of the mistakes we make sometimes in India is seeing a downturn elsewhere as necessarily beneficial for us. I think it's important to say that we would never benefit from another large country doing badly. There may be silver linings in the sense that commodity prices may be cheaper, etc., etc. We may compete less, we may have less competition in certain areas. But the world, again and again, we're discovering is so interconnected that any problem elsewhere in the world comes back to affect us very quickly. We are not immune.
Okay, regional moving towards West Asia. I was intrigued by your comment about becoming an aviation hub. The sense we have here in India is that we've more or less exported our aviation market to the West Asians. And your comments were suggesting that there is another way of doing it. So would you like to elaborate?
You're looking at me, or? Okay. Well, no, I don't have much detail to add on this. But I think 10 years ago, you couldn't make this claim because there was a problem with Indian airports. That is no longer the case. And you have in Delhi and Mumbai infrastructure that allows you to play a major regional and global role. It's a tremendous source of business. It creates many jobs. Singapore may be an extreme example because we're small, but the number of quality jobs created because of the airport and logistics is very large. It's a significant chunk of our total workforce. Quality jobs at every part of that chain. So I think it's a real opportunity for India in terms of job creation, for business value creation, but it means a paradigm shift, recognizing that connectivity benefits the broader economy and ultimately benefits everyone, including individual airlines.
Dr. Rajan, I want to pose this as a broader question to you, which is that there is a view on economic policy which says you need to be strategic in the way you approach policy from a national perspective versus an approach which says you just need to be more open and the benefits will flow. Now, many countries play this differently. We've tried to play it in one way on solar energy. We've tried different things at different stages in aviation. Where do you broadly come in on this? Are you on the sort of strategic policy side, or are you on the open market side?
I think I'm going to give the economist's answer. It depends. There are certain areas where you do have to nurture structures, and saying the market would develop those structures may be a little too over-optimistic. So I guess that is what you mean by strategic. You're sort of creating domestic structures that can survive in a broader world. But also those structures can't be nurtured forever. They have to link up, they have to compete after the appropriate nurturing.
Of course.
And then there are other places where you have fully established entities, and if you let them have their way, you will never have competition. You will have essentially all the problems of monopoly, and that's where let them compete, bring everybody in, and see what happens. So I think it really depends from place to place. I think for the most part, in many industries, we have pretty strong players. And so we certainly, for us, the brunt is of opening up and liberalizing rather than protecting. But there may be certain areas where that is strategic
thinking. Focusing briefly on domestic issues, before I throw this open to the floor for questions and we wind up in about 20 minutes. Dr. Shanmugaratnam, you are now also the Minister for Coordinating Economic and Social Policies. Could you explain what that means? What I have heard, I'm not sure if it's correct, what I have heard is that you are looking at where Singapore can or should be 20 years down the road, and then how to prepare to get there. Is that a correct reading?
Well, I think that there are two ways of thinking about it. One, as you say, is it's got to be deeply ingrained in policy making that the long term is what we have to be centrally focused on. And what we do in the short term has to be a way of getting to the long term. That has to be deeply ingrained in our thinking. We're trying to do that as well as possible in Singapore. In a world where it's very hard to predict what will happen in the long term, but all the more that we need to develop the capabilities and the institutions that can respond to changes as they occur and still give us a decent chance of getting to higher productivity, higher incomes, and greater resilience. Especially because we don't know what's going to happen. But it means you've got to invest now in institutions of collaboration between public and private sector, capabilities and skills that are deeper than we used to have, and a certain resilience and adaptability. So that's very important, and it's not just about an education ministry or trade and industry ministry. It's about some degree of concert within government and a way of collaborating with the private sector that is not, as Dr. Rajan was saying, was cautioning about, that is not a sort of a top-down industrial policy, but is market-driven and market-friendly. So that's one, something which I spend a lot of time on. The second thing I would say, which is important, is, whatever Singapore's achievements are, they have been founded on social policies, much more than economic. Our strategies to do with education, with housing, and with promoting an inclusive workplace, and increasingly now, ensuring that we have adequate care, affordable and quality care for an older population. That's the foundation of Singapore. It's what gives us a unique social identity, particularly our neighborhoods and our housing strategies, but that's also what gives us confidence in the future. The economic strategies will have to be nimble, they will have to be responsive to a changing world environment, but they are founded on a social model that's still evolving, but which we see as central to what Singapore is about.
Thank you. Raghu, I want to ask you again, how might you dovetail short-term into long-term in India's financial sector? There was a report on Mumbai as an international financial center. There is a whole gift idea. We are at the moment focused much more on domestic short-term issues and the health of the banking system plus financial inclusion. How do you see this playing out? How would you like to see this playing out?
Yeah. Let me just add to what Tharman said about Singapore. And, Singapore in many ways is confronting many of the problems that industrial countries have, but actually doing something about it in very thoughtful and innovative ways. I think, again and again, when I see the quality of Singapore's administration and the kinds of actions they're thinking about, for example, the continuing education of their people, something we talked about earlier this morning, how they're setting aside money for each individual to go out and get more education as and when they need it. I think that's a very interesting process. I think on the social side, let us not minimize the forces that are traveling around the world. And I think one of the most important sources of concern, which you've seen with some of these Panama reports and so on, it's building into this notion of the illegitimacy of wealth. Earlier, the crisis built up the idea that the bankers were illegitimate, that crony capitalism was illegitimate, all of which makes sense. But that's moved on since Piketty to passive wealth holdings are illegitimate. That if you're a coupon clipper who's clipping what your parents gave you as inheritance, perhaps you shouldn't have so much, and it should be redistributed. But now increasingly there's talk about whether entrepreneurial wealth is illegitimate, whether self-made people, whether they should have what they have, and whether that's something that's fair game. I think this is dangerous. And the fact that there are occasions when people are found to be hiding their wealth, as in the Panama allegations, essentially contributes to this process of delegitimization. I think what Tharman was talking about improving the opportunities across the board, is extremely important to sustain the legitimacy of wealth. If a whole horde of people, whole sections of society don't feel they have the opportunity, then the focus is going to be on those who have it and who have made it and say that is illegitimate. Yes. And I think that's something very important. It's something that we're seeing elements of in our own society, but certainly it's full-fledged in industrial countries. It's something that we need to worry about at the global level. And it's, I think the answer has to be increase opportunity across the board. And that's where I think some of the actions that are taking place here, the focus on job creation is extremely important. Now, that's where when you think about finance, it has to be with a purpose. And I think it has to be as handmaiden to entrepreneurship. Finance can't create entrepreneurship, but the financier can help the entrepreneur finance enterprise. It can help the householder manage risks and so on. And so with that in mind, helping the enterprise, helping the householder, and also helping government raise money, we have to figure out the appropriate markets, the appropriate institutions. You talked about Mumbai as an international financial center. I think that may well happen down the line. But I think we need to do a lot of things to make our banking sector more vibrant. The entry of a whole set of new banks, of different kinds of banks, will help, but also improving the capabilities of the existing banks is extremely important, which is why the asset cleanup is part of the answer. And of course, markets. We need to strengthen markets. We need to allow a whole set of new instruments, a whole set of new participants. Day before yesterday, we announced the attempt to get retail participants into the GSEC market. We have a whole lot of new technology which allows this to happen. And we have to make sure we can do this in a safe way. So I think there's a lot we have to do. I think of Mumbai as an international financial center as an outcome once we do it. But let's focus on the steps in making the financial sector more vibrant. And that's where I think the Deputy Prime Minister's discussion about the kinds of linkages we can have. And one can even think about linkages on the financial side. Some elements of legal services provided in Singapore for the issuance of securities, either in Mumbai or in Singapore, which could be rupee denominated. I mean, there's so many, I wanted to slip this in somewhere. Let me slip it in. I've heard professionals in India talk about Singapore as India's most livable city. So the point is there are ties that can be built, and there are natural affinities between India and Singapore which we can build on, and I think it's very valuable to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. We now move to questions from the floor. I think there are mics around, and the lady up here in front. Can we get a mic there? Yeah. If you don't mind, just for the benefit of everyone present, do please introduce yourself. And if you're addressing a question to any one of our two distinguished speakers, then do please say so.
This is Preeti Davra. I write a column for Mint. My question is to both the speakers, and the question is on South Asia. According to a World Bank report, it's one of the fastest growing regions in the world. I'd like to know, from Singapore and India's point of view, what do the speakers see as an opportunity that did not exist before geopolitically and also in trade and business?
Well, I would say, first, there's opportunity to benefit from connectivity. And in that regard, there's clearly opportunity within South Asia itself. But if you think about the basis on which countries have done well, about the way they've specialized, the way they've complemented each other, sometimes connectivity with countries that are very different from you provides even more benefits. Countries that are at different stages of economic development, that have different specializations, it provides tremendous benefit. So I would say connectivity within South Asia is an opportunity, but connectivity between South Asia and East Asia still has a lot of mileage left in it. East Asia is still seeing that being played out, even in the context of the inshoring into China that I was talking about. You're still getting a lot of benefits going to Vietnam, to Indonesia, and the like. Countries which do not have very different natural endowments or human capital advantages compared to India, for instance. And I would say if you look at the strength of Indian corporates, Indian professionals, Indian experts in various fields, I think we're not fully exploiting or maximizing the potential of what that can bring to the Indian economy.
I really don't have anything to add to that. I think that connectivity is extremely important. Lots of potential for increased trade within the region, lots of potential for increased financial services. We, of course, are working with many of the countries in South Asia in various fora, including, for example, we have a swap agreement with many of the, with all the central banks. And that swap agreement has actually been used by some of the countries. So broadly, we can build, there's a lot to build on, and there's a long way to go. But I think physical connectivity will be extremely important in this process.
Okay, there's a hand that went up at the back first, and then oh well, we have 4 hands. I'll try and cover everybody, but the gentleman right at the back.
Good morning, sir. My question is to Deputy Prime Minister. Governor has mentioned in brief that hiding money, because many reports and the officials who keep a tab on the black money, they have reported saying Singapore is the emerging hub for most of the Indians to hide their money. Your perspective on that? And second important part, when you talk about partnership, it's a partnership between two investigative agencies as well. So LR has been sent against Lalit Modi a year back. There's not a single response from Singapore to the Indian government. What's your perspective on that? Lalit Modi.
Thank you. We'll take 1 or 2 other questions, and then, yes, over here. Just 1 question, please, each. There are others also waiting.
Yeah, I am Captain Richard Sequeira, Director of Marine Maritime. I have a very important question. Just let me frame it. 30 years ago, Deng Xiaoping said China must learn from Singapore. And cut a long story short, they have implemented a lot of policies. It has come to a very high degree of development. We lag behind. How can Singapore teach India in its planning, city-state, smart cities, trade and investment, to be what Singapore is today in another 30 years? Second highest per capita income, greater reserves in foreign exchange than India, and other things.
Okay, we've got it. So we have 3 questions, so you can choose which you want to address.
Well, first, I should address the point about, I didn't catch the exact words you used, but the idea that, Indians were hiding money in Singapore, if I can summarize what you said. Singapore's totally open to scrutiny. We're not some shady offshore center with coconut palms. We're totally open to scrutiny. And I would say we should scrutinize every jurisdiction in the world, including, by the way, states within the United States. Everyone should be open to scrutiny. We do not protect any holy cows in Singapore. Let me make that quite clear. On your question about smart cities and what can be learned, let me say that I really see this intrinsically as a journey of mutual learning. India may, in aggregate, be behind the curve in the quality of its cities, but India has innovations that are ahead of many in the same area. It's a bit of a paradox. Overall, an environment that's messy, weak, and this is what Prime Minister Modi is trying to tackle, but they're already, maybe almost because of the of how people have been held back, there's some who are leapfrogging, and there are innovations that are in advance of the rest of the world. If you look at the way the digital revolution is being used to empower rural individuals, let alone software engineers, enabling them to scale up, to aggregate what they can do, and even to reach global markets as individuals or just as collectives, I think it's really impressive. So for Singapore, this is not a journey of teaching India or lending our expertise to India, but of participating in our journeys together, because we think we will also learn something from you on this journey.
Raghu, do you want to come in? Okay, there were a couple of other questions over here. There's a hand went up there. I can see a lot of hands. I'll try and accommodate as much as we can. Yes.
Akhil Shahani from the Shahani Group of Colleges. I'd actually talk specifically about collaboration opportunities in skilling and higher education between Singapore and India. Are there any initiatives that the Singapore government is doing to promote collaboration opportunities for education entrepreneurs like myself?
And I think there was a lady at the back who had a hand up. I'll come back this side.
Hello, good morning. My name is Lata Mohandas. I'm from Datacom, Incom Datacom. I wear into data services. My question is to Mr. Rajan. There's been a lot of talk and comparison between India and Singapore. What I would like to know is that the infrastructure projects and infrastructure companies in India are facing a huge liquidity crunch. In spite of the easing measures that you have taken, banks are not lending. And we know in Singapore, infrastructure is top-notch. I mean, that's what's made it a world-class city. So my question to you, Mr. Rajan, is what are you going to do? I also heard you mention a few days ago that you were going to be allowing foreign investment into infrastructure projects and for foreign companies to be able to borrow. So what are the what measures are you going to take to hedge the currency risks involved to avoid a 1997 financial crisis that was mainly led by infrastructure projects the currency falling and not being able to meet commitments?
I'll talk about the schools. So on skills training and education, one of the key features of the Singapore system is an emphasis on skills training as distinct from traditional academic learning. And particularly beyond the age of 16, there's a very strong emphasis even today on skills as a way of developing the individual and as a way of, at the same time, serving the needs of an economy. The lessons from Singapore's institutional framework, as well as the way in which we devise curriculum and try to keep it up to date and industry relevant, are of interest to India and a range of other countries. We now have a project going in Delhi. We've started something in Rajasthan as well, quite specialized in Rajasthan. I think it's to do with the skills in the tourism sector. But these are lessons we are very happy to impart and to collaborate with India on. But I just want to make that point, that all over Asia, there was an overemphasis on the academic route to advancement. It's not matching needs in industry, and it will lead, as we're already seeing in places like Korea, even China, it leads to great frustration on the part of people graduating from colleges. So we've got to re-gear and orient ourselves towards a skills journey for a very significant part of our workforce, starting in the college years and continuing through life at regular intervals during their career. That's what we are embarked on in Singapore. We call it Skills Future, and it's about continuous infusions of knowledge and expertise at different stages of your career. We're developing an infrastructure, and it's going to be a very important journey for us going forward.
So, on the issue of infrastructure and hedging, I mean, our aim in the macro stabilization that the Deputy Prime Minister talked about is broadly to make the exchange rate less and less of an issue that investors have to worry about. We have, in the past, intervened on both sides to minimize volatility. But if we move towards our inflation target of around 4%, then the years of the past where you had extreme volatility in the rupee because the rupee inflation in India was much higher than the world, will become a thing of the past. But even putting that aside, if you look over long horizons, 5 to 10 years, you will find that the depreciation in the rupee essentially matches inflation differentials. And therefore, anybody who invests at rupee rates gets an appropriate return to match the kind of depreciation risk that they're taking. Put differently, if a foreign investor wants to lend to India over a long run for infrastructure projects, the value of the rupee at the end of the project is probably a second-order concern, should be a second-order concern.
Really?
So my question is to the... So my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. So God forbidding Donald Trump wins the election. What is going to happen to the American economy? What is going to happen to the Indian economy? And what is going to happen to the Singapore economy?
Gosh. And the last question, the gentleman in the corner there. You wanted somebody else here? Oh, okay, and one more there.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Alok Gupta. I run a full-scale manufacturing marketing business in this region. My question is really triggered by the global trade that you talked about. It's declining, and of course we have the experience of almost 25 years of globalization, low tariff barriers, and product moving across. With this experience, we now, let's say, see that a huge capacity got created. Let's talk of steel sector. Huge capacities got created in China. The capacities around the world are now closing down. The commodity prices went up, and there was so-called dumping across. Now, in view of this experience, how do you view the kind of model of globalization which came into being, and how do you see it moving forward? This is for both of you.
Okay, and the final question from there, please, at the back.
Shirish Apte. I'm formerly Citigroup Asia Pacific, and I live in India's most livable city, Singapore. The question, I'd like to go back to global trade and address the question both to the Deputy Prime Minister and to the Governor. There's a clamoring today in Europe for anti-dumping duties from the steel industry. The United States has already done that, and I think here in India also a number of corporates are worried about what China is doing to India's trade. Equally, the political rhetoric in the presidential election is very anti-trade. Are you concerned that politicians might, as an expedient, simply clamp down on the free trade, which has actually led to growth in global economy?
Okay, last comments, and then we'll...
Well, the questions, I think, allow us to summarize a fair bit of what we were saying. There are two problems with current-day policy responses. First, this borrows from what both Raghu and I were saying, is that monetary policy, in attempting to stimulate economies and nurse them back to health, has in fact relied too much on exchange rates as a means of transmission. I don't think anyone can argue that quarter percentage point, 25 basis point, or even 50 basis point, or even 1 percentage point change in interest rates can make a huge difference to the type of investments that would now qualify from funding. But what's really happened is exchange rates have moved in a big way, and they've led to a rotation of demand from one part of the world to another, rather than the creation of demand. So it started with the United States, with the weakening of the US dollar after the crisis. It then moved on to Japan, 40% weakening of the yen. And it's then moved on to Europe, 20% weakening of the euro. And this merely leads to a rotation of demand because of significant effects on competitiveness between countries and regions, rather than the creation of demand. That's one problem with the current approach. Second problem is what was referred to in the second question, which is how do we deal with overcapacity and overhangs? We know the problems in steel, cement in China and elsewhere. And the market mechanism does exist for dealing with this problem. It's about restructuring, and it's about the write-down of bad loans and bad assets. That's the market mechanism. And in fact, it has to be said that that's a strength of the American economy. They restructure faster than most, and they come back up with new players coming in, buying assets cheap, and trying to combine them with other assets and make good. But if we simply hold on to what we have, if we hold on to excess capacity, and we don't restructure, we are keeping bad assets on the books of banks, and we are also exporting deflation within our own countries and internationally, which is not at all optimal. So if you take these two types of policy responses, exchange rate, monetary policy that really has its effect through exchange rates, which merely rotates demand rather than creates demand, and secondly, not moving decisively enough to restructure industries that have overcapacity, not just for the short term, but for the medium to long term, we really get a suboptimal situation. You get volatility, you get deflation, and you don't get a real lift in productivity and incomes. So what we're really saying is let's focus on the fundamentals of the real economy, which have to do with skills, technology, and connectivity. There's still so much we can do in each of these areas: skills, technology, connectivity. If we do that well, I think it gives more confidence to ordinary people that their jobs can be preserved, or if their jobs are no longer relevant, they can be trained for another job. If we do that well and give the middle class some confidence in the future, give everyone confidence in the future, we are more likely to see a politics that doesn't lead to this surreptitious closing of trade, tightening of trade, raising of barriers. It's more likely to be a world where you see openness because people know that they are being equipped with skills, they do have a future. And they see prosperity in their own neighborhoods and communities, not just somewhere far away.
Just 2 cents on that. I absolutely agree with everything Tharman said. But the additional element, going back to what to some extent he said earlier, is that the beneficiaries of free trade today are distinct in many countries from the sufferers from free trade. And it's very hard to make the two meet. So for example, you mentioned a certain politician in the United States. A lot of the people who seem to be sympathizing with him are people who've seen factories closing down in their neighborhoods, who've seen manufacturing disappear, and who therefore, for a while, were rescued by the housing boom because they found jobs in construction, etc. But after the housing bust, are now really angry, not just because they've bought houses which are now terribly underwater, but because they don't have jobs, many going on disability. So there is a real issue there, but the issue is not stopping trade. If you ask the question, who is the world's biggest outsourcer in services? Let me ask you that question. Who's the biggest outsourcer in services in the world? I think many of you would think India. It's actually the United States. Legal services, consulting services, financial services, they're the biggest outsourcer. But the people providing those services very different from the people hurting from manufacturing imports. So I think it goes back to what Tharman said, that we need to find ways to improve the quality of life, the access to opportunities, the capability of doing good work across the board, but especially amongst the weaker segments of society. That is as true of Singapore, as true of the United States, as it is true for India. So I think we all have our work cut out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are completely out of time, so I would like to hand you back to the organizers after thanking our two speakers for their very thoughtful comments and for taking all the questions. Thank you both. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Rajan and Mr. Ninan, for such an insightful and engaging session. DPM Tharman will now present tokens of appreciation to Dr. Rajan and Mr. Ninan for joining him on the interactive session. The book entitled Nation at Play, A History of Sport in India is authored by Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, Dr. Ronajoy Sen, and this book has been recently launched in several places, both in India and Singapore. First at the Jaipur Literary Salon, followed by a book fair in Kolkata, and then just 2 weeks ago in India. 2 weeks ago in Singapore, the third launch. Yeah, so one more. We would like to have a group photograph with the three of you and some of the organizers. Yeah. Okay. DPN, Dr. Rajan, and Mr. Ninan will remain on stage as we invite the organizers for group photography. Ambassador Pillai, His Excellency Mr. T.K. Lim. No, first is a photography session, Chairman, yeah. And Mr. Nainat Kirby for the group photography, please. Sir, we will just take Thank you, DPM and everyone. Thank you. We still have one more item, so we would really appreciate if you could take your seats. We have a vote of thanks, so we would appreciate if you could just be seated for a couple of minutes. Now to deliver his vote of thanks, we have with us the Deputy Chairman of CII Western Region, Mr. Kirby, to say a few words. Mr. Kirby, please. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll be a little brief. Dignitaries present here, ladies and gentlemen, we had a wonderful session. I would like to thank Deputy Prime Minister and Dr. Rajan for coming here this morning and sharing their insights with us. I would also like to thank ISAS for bringing this business delegation to Bombay. We are particularly delighted when Deputy Prime Minister reminded us of the positives in India and also emphasizing about education and skilling, which we are passionate about, and Governor Rajan for talking about the natural ties and affinities between India and Singapore. Sessions like these go a long way in increasing cooperation between India and Singapore. I would also like to thank, in conclusion, my friend Mr. Ninan for moderating the session. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for kindness. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today. While you're still making some moves around the room, let me just share with you that today's proceedings will be uploaded on the Institute of South Asian Studies website in a few weeks' time. So do look out for it. Thank you and have a great day. And do join us for the buffet lunch just outside at the foyer. Thank you once again and have a great day ahead. Thank you.